Millionaire pretends to be blind to test his employees' honesty and character. What he discovers leaves him stunned. Since he was young, Anthony had always believed that wealth gave him independence, but also an inevitable isolation. Heir to a vast fortune, he built an empire and expanded his inheritance, living surrounded by luxury and comfort. His mansion was immaculate, maintained by employees who ensured that every detail was in order. His routine was organized, without any surprises or worries. To anyone who looked at him, his life seemed perfect. However, behind the appearance of fulfillment, Anthony lacked true emotional bonds. He never had a wife, children, or many friends. His existence was surrounded only by those who worked for him, the employees who managed his house, prepared his meals, and kept his life running smoothly. To Anthony, these employees were more than mere workers. They were the only constant presence around him, the ones who made sure that his routine continued flawlessly. Many had served him for years, knew his habits, his preferences, his schedule. He trusted them without hesitation, as they had never given him a reason to doubt their loyalty. They were efficient, discreet, and always performed their duties with absolute precision. Even without family ties or true friendships, Anthony felt he wasn't completely alone. He believed that the daily interaction with his employees made them a sort of family, people he could fully trust. For him, their loyalty didn't need to be questioned. Years of service and dedication were enough proof that they were by his side for more than just a paycheck. But everything changed one night when an old friend introduced an unexpected doubt, making Anthony see his reality from a new perspective. One evening, while enjoying a dinner at a restaurant, Anthony was having a relaxed conversation with his old friend Kenneth. The man, with his sharp gaze and always sincere words, was known for his bluntness, never hesitating to speak his mind. Between sips of wine and hearty bites, they discussed business, old memories, and travels. Everything flowed as usual, until at some point, Kenneth set his utensils down and leaned slightly forward, observing Anthony with attention. "Tell me something, Anthony," said Kenneth in a casual tone, but with underlying intent. "Have you never thought about starting a family, getting married, having kids, someone you can truly count on?" Anthony let out a brief laugh, picking up his wine glass and swirling the liquid slowly before taking a small sip. "I don't see the need," he said, not seeming disturbed by the question. "My life is structured, comfortable. I don't miss anything." "Are you sure?" Kenneth raised an eyebrow. "And what about having someone who truly cares about you? Someone who's not there out of obligation or convenience?" Anthony adjusted the napkin on his lap and looked up at his friend. "But I already have people like that," he replied with conviction. "The employees in my house have been with me for years. Some came when they were young and have grown old in my service. They take care of everything to make sure my life runs smoothly. They are loyal, reliable. I don't need more than that." "Oh," Kenneth sighed and shook his head, as if he had already expected this answer. "Anthony, you're fooling yourself," he said, leaning back in his chair. "These people work for you. They're not your family. They're employees. And if they've been with you for years, it's because you pay well and offer stability. But tell me something." He paused for a moment, staring directly into Anthony's eyes. "If tomorrow your fortune disappeared, how many of them would stay out of their own will?" The question made Anthony furrow his brow slightly. He had never thought of it that way. To him, the time spent together and the years of service were proof of loyalty. "What are you implying?" he asked, keeping his voice firm. "That you live surrounded by people who are only there because they need your money? Do you really think anyone in that house cares about you beyond the paycheck they receive?" Silence settled over the table for a moment. Anthony didn't respond immediately. He just held his wine glass, spinning it between his fingers, lost in thought. "They've always been honest with me," he said after a moment. "I've never had a reason to doubt their loyalty." Because you've never had reason to test that loyalty, Kenneth retorted. But what if you couldn't supervise what goes on in your house? What if you were completely dependent on them? How would you know if they're still the same? The words hung in the air like a dense cloud. Anthony tried to ignore the weight of the insinuation, but deep down, a feeling of unease was beginning to grow. What if Kenneth was right? What if his trust was naive? The conversation drifted to other topics, but Anthony's mind was already far away. Kenneth's words echoed like a persistent whisper. When he returned to the mansion that night, everything seemed as usual. The comforting silence filled the hallways, and every detail of the house remained flawless, as though nothing had ever been out of place. As soon as he got out of the car, the door was opened by Charles, his longtime butler, a discreet and meticulous man who had always maintained an impeccable posture. He greeted him politely, with the same neutral and professional tone as always, before stepping aside to let Anthony in. As he walked through the entry hall, he spotted Barbara, one of the newer employees, crossing the corridor with a basket of clean laundry in her arms. Unlike the other older employees who had become used to the presence of the master and carried out their tasks with calculated indifference, Barbara seemed always focused on being attentive, performing her duties with care. Her eyes were lowered, focused on what she was doing, but when she noticed Anthony's presence, she straightened her posture for a brief moment before continuing on her way. Everything in the house was as it always had been. But for the first time, Anthony looked at them with new eyes. What if he had been wrong about all of them? In the following nights, Anthony tried to push Kenneth's words out of his mind, but the doubt had already taken root. He continued his routine as usual, but something inside him had changed. Without realizing it, he started observing his employees more closely. Small details he had previously ignored now caught his attention. When he passed through the hallways, he noticed discreet glances exchanged between the staff, conversations that stopped abruptly as soon as he approached. Sometimes when giving simple orders, he noticed a slight delay in their responses, as if they hesitated for a moment before obeying. Has it always been this way? He wondered. Or am I just noticing now because Kenneth planted this doubt in my mind? The uncertainty gnawed at his confidence. He refused to believe that he had spent years living alongside people who were merely pretending loyalty. But what if it was true? What if, deep down, they were just playing a role, waiting for him never to question anything? One morning, as he was having breakfast in the large dining room, he deliberately dropped one of his utensils on the floor. The slight clink of metal against the floor echoed through the silent room. Instinctively, he bent down to pick it up, but at the exact moment he leaned over, he caught a subtle movement out of the corner of his eye. Charles, standing near the door, quickly looked away, as if fearing being caught. What was he looking at? Thought Anthony, slowly picking up the fork. He felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. Something inside him told him that this glance was not just a reflection of the butler's always controlled demeanor. The doubt grew. That afternoon, he decided to test something new. He called one of the employees and asked him to organize some important documents in his office. When the employee left, Anthony returned minutes later and noticed that one of the papers was not exactly in the same place where he had left it. It was a tiny detail, insignificant to anyone else, but he knew how he always organized his things. It was as if his vision was becoming sharper, not physically, but in the way he perceived the intentions around him. That night he sat in his chair in the office, staring at the darkness outside the large glass window. For the first time, he felt a genuine unease inside his own house. If he couldn't trust his employees completely, then what remained? But how could he discover the truth? He stood up and began pacing the office, frustration growing. He needed to do something, to find a way to observe without being observed. But how? Then an odd and unexpected thought came to him. What if I couldn't see? He stopped in the middle of the office, feeling the idea expand within his mind. If I were blind, would they still act the same way? It was an absurd idea. Or maybe not. Blindness would make him vulnerable. It would force him to depend entirely on them. And more importantly, it would ensure they believed he couldn't see anything happening around him. A shiver ran down his spine. The idea was risky, but it made sense. If there was a way to test the loyalty of his employees, this was the best option. His fingers clenched by his side, he needed the truth. The next morning, Anthony decided to put his plan into action. After breakfast, he gathered all the employees in the large living room. He sat in his leather chair, crossed his hands over his knees, and took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to thank everyone for the good work you've been doing," he began in a firm but calm tone. "But I need to communicate something important." The employees remained attentive, some exchanging discreet glances. Charles, always impeccable and discreet, maintained his neutral posture. Barbara, standing next to the others, seemed slightly apprehensive. "This afternoon, I'll be having a small eye surgery," Anthony continued, pausing briefly to gauge their reactions. "The doctor said it's a simple procedure, but the recovery will require care. I'll be unable to see for a few weeks until my eyes heal completely." The silence that followed was brief but revealing. Some employees exchanged quick glances, as if trying to interpret what this meant. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," said Charles after a moment. "This means we'll need to reorganize your routine to ensure your needs are met in the best way possible." "Exactly," Anthony replied. "During this time, I'll need to rely on all of you to help me move around and perform basic tasks. Trusting each one of you completely will be essential." "Of course, sir," Barbara responded promptly. "We'll do our best to ensure your recovery is smooth." Anthony noticed something in her voice. It was genuine, unlike the others, who seemed to process the situation in silence or show contained concern. Barbara spoke with a different tone, more spontaneous, more human. As for Charles, something in his posture made Anthony uncomfortable. It wasn't anything explicit, just a small detail that Anthony couldn't ignore. With the plan communicated, Anthony stood up and ended the conversation. Everything had been done as convincingly as possible. Now all he had to do was wait and see how the employees would react when he returned blind. And so, hours later, Anthony returned to the mansion. He was wearing dark glasses that covered his eyes completely and held a cane for the visually impaired, gently gliding it along the floor as he walked with careful steps. His expression was serene, but inside, his heart was racing. Every detail of this moment was crucial. If he wanted his plan to succeed, he had to play his part perfectly. As he crossed the door, pretending not to see anything, his real observation began. "Welcome back, sir," said Charles, his voice calm and formal as always. "Thank you, Charles," replied Anthony, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to orient himself by sound. "I need to get used to this new reality, so I'm counting on you all." "Naturally, sir," replied the butler. "We'll be at your disposal to help with whatever you need." Barbara, who was nearby, quickly approached. "Would you like me to accompany you to your chair?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "Yes, please," said Anthony, extending his hand hesitantly as if seeking support. She gently took his arm, guiding him patiently to the chair in the living room. Anthony noticed her light and careful touch, something different from Charles's contained and precise posture. He could see everything, behind the dark glasses, and every gesture, every exchanged look between the employees, now became visible in a completely new way. In the first days, the routine in the house seemed unchanged. The employees continued to perform their duties, cleaning was done, meals were served at the usual times, and the house remained flawless. To anyone, nothing had changed. But Anthony, now observing without being observed, began to notice the first signs that something was different. He noticed the quick glances exchanged between the staff when he passed, the whispers that ceased abruptly when he approached. Barbara, however, stood out among them all. While some maintained a mechanical posture, performing their duties without showing real concern, she was the only one who seemed truly attentive to his well-being. When Anthony walked around the house, pretending to feel his way through the furniture to orient himself, he saw how Barbara discreetly moved chairs out of the way, prevented him from bumping into objects, and even subtly extended her hand to steady him when she sensed he was about to trip. "Would you like me to read some documents for you?" she asked one afternoon when he was sitting in his office. "If you can," Anthony replied, watching as she picked up the papers on the table. She read each line clearly, without hesitation, without discomfort. There was no rush in her voice, just patience. Anthony realized she was there not just because it was her job, but because she wanted to help. Meanwhile, Charles began to show a different behavior. Anthony, behind his dark glasses, saw everything. He saw how the butler hesitated slightly when handling money, how he took a little longer to deliver payments, how his hands trembled when handing back documents. One day, Anthony decided to test his suspicion. "Charles," he said, sitting at the desk in his office, "I need you to take some money from my wallet to pay the supplier who will arrive later." He opened the wallet and left it on the table intentionally, as if disoriented. The vision behind the dark glasses allowed him to see everything. Charles approached, took the wallet, and began separating the amount. Anthony saw his fingers sliding over the bills, taking the exact sum. But then, at the last moment, something happened. An extra movement, a subtle slide, the sound of another note being pulled out, folded discreetly, and hidden before the wallet was returned. Anthony didn't react. He simply nodded, took the wallet back, and put it away as if nothing had happened. But inside, his heart raced. "So that's it?" he thought, keeping his expression neutral. That night, lying in his bed, Anthony reflected on what he had witnessed. Is it really what I think, or am I exaggerating? But he knew the truth. He had seen clearly. The next day, he decided to increase the test. He spread money in different places around the house, in a drawer in his office, in a coat pocket in the closet, in a box on the nightstand. Before asking Charles to take any of it, he memorized exactly how much he had left. And that's how, in the following days, he began to notice a pattern. Some bills simply disappeared, always subtly, as if Charles was testing how far he could go without raising suspicion. But the final confirmation came in another way. One afternoon, Anthony pretended to need to sign a check. "Charles, please, can you hold the checkbook while I try to sign?" he said, extending his hand hesitantly. The butler approached and placed the checkbook in front of him. Anthony pretended to struggle with the pen, scribbling his signature with uncertain movements. A few seconds later, Charles handed it back to him. Anthony held it for a moment, as if just orienting himself, and felt something strange. The weight seemed different. That same night, he took advantage of a moment when he was alone to discreetly search his office. And then, he found the missing proof, a carbon copy of a filled-out check, with a higher amount than agreed upon. He closed his eyes behind the dark glasses. The final blow had been struck. The betrayal was real. For years, Anthony had believed that Charles was a man of trust, someone he could rely on without questioning. But now, the truth was clear. Charles wasn't just an ordinary thief. He had taken advantage of the trust Anthony had placed in him and the supposed vulnerability of his blindness. He knew that his boss couldn't check amounts, count money, or review documents without help. And he used this false weakness to steal. Rage burned inside Anthony, but he knew he couldn't act just yet. No, he needed to see how far Charles would go. Days passed, and Anthony continued his charade with precision. He kept his careful steps, hesitant gestures, and empty expression, as if truly unable to see anything around him. But behind the dark glasses, he saw everything. He saw how Charles, once meticulous and discreet, now seemed bolder, less worried about being discovered. It was as if, after the first small successful thefts, he had gained the confidence to go further. At first, it was only small amounts that disappeared, isolated bills, taken almost imperceptibly. But soon, Anthony noticed that Charles was starting to take more risks. One day, when he asked the butler to take money from a specific drawer in his desk, he clearly saw the man separate a larger amount than necessary and quickly stash part of it in his own pocket before handing over the rest. Another time, when asking him to retrieve an envelope with important documents, Anthony noticed that Charles took longer than usual. When he finally returned, he appeared normal, but Anthony saw when the butler discreetly slid an extra sheet into his own suit before handing over what had been requested. The audacity grew. Charles wasn't just stealing small amounts of money anymore. He had started tampering with financial documents, changing amounts in records, and hiding receipts that could expose him. Anthony watched it all, but remained silent, waiting for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, Barbara continued to be a constant presence by his side. With patience and kindness, she helped him navigate the house, making sure he didn't face difficulties. She always offered help spontaneously, without hesitation, and Anthony realized that her concern was genuine. She wasn't doing this just because it was her job. There was something in her posture, in her voice, that showed she truly cared. "Do you need anything else, sir?" she asked one evening, after helping him settle for dinner. "No, Barbara, you've already done so much for me," Anthony replied, watching her behind the dark glasses. "I appreciate your dedication." She smiled faintly, a real smile, and simply nodded before returning to her tasks. Anthony now knew for sure Charles was a traitor and Barbara was an ally, but he still needed to see how far Charles would go. And indeed, the butler didn't stop. A few days before Anthony decided to end his charade, he witnessed Charles's boldest act. He asked him to take a considerable amount from the safe for a payment. Charles, thinking his boss couldn't see, took the money and without hesitation separated a large portion for himself, quickly slipping it into his coat pocket before handing over the rest. The brazenness was evident. Charles no longer seemed to have any fear. That night, Anthony lay in bed and reflected. "I've seen enough," he thought, feeling the anger rise inside him. Tomorrow will be the day. The next morning, he gathered all the employees in the large living room. He entered the room with careful steps, supporting himself on the cane and keeping his expression neutral. Everyone was there, standing, waiting. Charles, as always, remained firm and impassive. Barbara seemed attentive but not nervous. The other employees stood in silence, waiting for Anthony to speak. He took a deep breath before breaking the illusion. "First of all, I want to thank you all for the work you've done during this time," he began, keeping a calm tone. "I know my condition made things a little more complicated for all of you." He paused briefly, pretending to hesitate, then removed his dark glasses slowly, revealing his eyes. There was a moment of complete silence. The employees stared at him, confused, while Barbara widened her eyes, surprised but showing no sign of guilt. As for Charles froze in place. "You see," Anthony continued, looking directly at the butler, "I've never been blind." The shock was immediate. Some employees exchanged glances, confused, while Barbara stared at him with wide eyes, surprised but without any sign of guilt. Charles, however, looked like a deer caught in the headlights. "I've been pretending to be blind to test your loyalty," Anthony said, his tone firm, "and what I discovered was, to say the least, revealing." He looked around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention, then turned to Charles. "I saw everything, Charles," Anthony said, not looking away. "I saw when you took money that didn't belong to you. I saw when you altered documents. I saw when you hid envelopes and manipulated values. I saw every one of your moves." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, unable to form a response. His face was pale, his eyes locked on Anthony as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. "I trusted you for years," Anthony continued, his voice heavy with frustration. "I always believed you were more than an employee, that you were someone I could trust, but it was all an illusion." Charles finally tried to justify himself. "Sir, I can explain," he started, his voice trembling. "There's no explanation that justifies betrayal," Anthony interrupted, cutting him off. "You stole from me, took advantage of a false vulnerability. You thought I'd never find out?" Silence filled the room. The other employees seemed uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact with Charles. Barbara, on the other hand, just watched everything without guilt or nervousness. "You're fired," Anthony declared, "and I want you out of my house immediately." Charles didn't argue. He couldn't. His face, once always expressionless and controlled, was now filled with silent desperation, as someone who knew their mistake had no way back. He lowered his head and, without saying another word, turned and left the room. A weight seemed to lift from Anthony's shoulders as he watched Charles leave the house, but he knew there was still more to be said. He turned to the other employees, silently observing them for a few moments. They all stood apprehensive, waiting to see what he would say next. He took a deep breath and then broke the silence. "Now that the most serious part is over, I want to say something to all of you." His voice no longer carried the coldness it once did, but rather a more reflective tone. "Throughout all this time that I've pretended to be blind, I observed each of you. I saw how you continued to do your jobs. I saw how the house stayed organized. I saw that you did your duties." The employees exchanged glances, unsure if this was a compliment or a veiled criticism. "But I also saw something that disappointed me," Anthony continued, crossing his hands in front of him. "None of you did anything I could call betrayal. I have no doubts about that. But I also didn't see effort beyond what was necessary. I didn't see anyone offering help with empathy, with kindness. I didn't see smiles, words of encouragement, gestures that went beyond what was strictly required. I was a man who, in theory, couldn't see, who depended on you for everything. And yet, most of you just did your jobs like machines, without showing even the slightest genuine concern. Some lowered their heads, embarrassed. Others kept their rigid posture, as if trying to justify themselves through silence. But there was one exception," Anthony said, letting his gaze settle on Barbara. "One person showed that she truly cared. One person acted not just as an employee, but as a human being." "Barbara," Anthony continued, taking a small step forward, "from the first day, you were the only one who showed sincere concern. Not only did you guide me around the house, but you did so with patience, with respect, without haste, without indifference. You didn't just do your job, you cared." The young woman stood still, her eyes slightly glistening, but without saying a word. "And that's why," Anthony continued, looking at the others, "I want to use you as an example for all of you. Because true loyalty isn't measured by years of service, by formality, or by duties done perfectly. It's in the way we treat those who depend on us. It's in care, kindness, empathy, and that's what only Barbara showed." He turned to her once more and smiled slightly. "That's why, Barbara, from today on, you will hold the position of highest trust in this house," Anthony said, looking directly at her. "I want you to take Charles's place. You will be responsible for ensuring everything works perfectly, but above all, I want you to be by my side, not only as an employee, but as someone I can truly trust." Barbara gave a hesitant smile, almost in disbelief. "Sir, I just did what I thought was right," she said, her voice filled with humility. "And that's exactly why you deserve it," Anthony replied, nodding. "Because you did the right thing without expecting anything in return. And that's rare. The other employees remained silent. There were no protests, no indignation. Deep down, they knew Anthony was right. They knew that throughout all that time they had simply done their jobs, while Barbara was the only one who did more than what was necessary. Time passed, and the changes began to manifest in the house. Barbara took on her new position with dedication, becoming not only an exemplary employee, but someone in whom Anthony truly trusted. The other employees, perhaps impacted by Anthony's words, began to act differently. There was more kindness, more attention to detail, more effort to make the house a welcoming place and not just a mechanical workspace. As for Charles, his name was never mentioned again. Anthony didn't worry about what happened to him after his dismissal. A man who betrays the trust of those who treated him as someone trustworthy didn't deserve a space in his memory. But the greatest change was not in the house. It was within Anthony. For the first time, he understood that loyalty isn't measured by years of service, by formality, or by duties done with precision. True loyalty revealed itself in the simple gestures, in the details of everyday life, in the way people treated those who could not immediately repay them. And it was from that day forward that he stopped seeing his house only as a perfectly managed space by employees. He began to truly see who the people were who genuinely cared about him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.